So, our standards and why we use them. Who am I? What am I doing here? I'm a developer working at Jump 24, work with Laravel, Cake PHP. We do test-driven development. Twitter, email, company website are there. We are currently recruiting across the board for remote positions, but you must be UK residents. So, why do we need standards at Jump 24? We have a lot of systems we use. And when I say a lot, I mean a lot. Our stack looks like Docker, Terraform, AWS, PHP, Nginx, Laravel, Inertia, React, Sass, MySQL, Redis, HTML5, CSS3, JavaScript, Webpack, Cake PHP, and there may be others in there as well that I've forgotten about at the time. So a key takeaway of this talk is standards help, and they enable developers to work together better. It simplifies code review, and it keeps code consistent across projects. So tonight we're going to talk mainly about our PHP standards and what we apply there. And we're going to use a small Laravel application as a demonstration of this. So PHP standards are the centerpiece of everything we do. In Laravel, we use linter, ECS, PHPScan, enlighten, and tests. Everything we do at Jump is thought of in terms of a hit by a bus scenario. If a developer were not available tomorrow, could somebody else pick up their work? Or, as the meme says, can you pick up your own work? The number of times I'll finish on a Friday, look back on a Monday and have no idea what I've just written is unbelievable. So what's linter? This isn't about making it pretty. This is about finding code errors. So here's an example of bad code. We've got a constant, we've got a simple function. At first glance, it might look okay, but there are actually a few errors here. So there's quite a few of them. So how would we run linter? Initially, we might try and run PHP and then the file that we're trying to execute. In this case, it gives us a syntax error and it tells us it happens to be on line 5 and it tells us that it's expecting a comma or a semicolon. The code fails to execute. Doesn't really give us much in the way of context of what we might be looking at. So how do we do this? We bring in a couple of packages. We'll bring in parallel lint and we'll bring in console highlighter. We'll then set ourselves up a simple little script that runs parallel lint and excludes the vendor folder because quite honestly, it's outside of the scope to be fixing linting errors in vendor packages. We'll run composer install and then we can run composer lint. So if we run composer lint across that file, we'll see that this gives us a lot more context. It gives us color and it tells us exactly where the error is. So it's telling us here that there was one syntax error found in one file, and that was on line 5. It points to exactly what that is, which is our function of echo me. Tells us that it was expecting to see a semicolon or a comma. And if we look around that, even just from what's on screen there, we can actually see there's 3 errors just from what's on screen there. The first one that it's pointing out is the constant. The my message equals something has no semicolon at the end of it. So we can now see what's wrong with that file. So let's fix it. We'll put the semicolon there. We'll actually give it the missing variable of the message. And each of these would have been, to a certain extent, picked up by the linter. And we'll actually run the function echo me with else being passed in. If we execute that again, we see that it executes and it runs something else as the output. So very low level, but it solves a fair few problems very easily. Now it's time to look at our standards packages. These are open source. They're available for anybody to use on Packagist. If you search for Jump 24, you'll find us there. And this is how we start to enforce our coding style. Let's bring in the packages we need. the two that we had previously. And then we'll bring in Jump 24 project analyzers, and we'll bring in Jump 24 PHP coding standards. We do also have a Laravel specific standard that is also available. That can be imported as well. That will help. At the time I created this slide, that wasn't separated out for Laravel and PHP. They now are. Then we set up some scripts. So we had the lint script we had before. We have a script to run ECS. We have a script to run PHPScan, one to run Enlighten, and then one to run our tests. So those pieced together, we often create the before push hook. That's also just a simple composer script that runs all of those lines in one go. We'll create ourselves a PHPScan file. We'll have the level set at 8, which is the highest level there is for PHPScan. We'll import the PHPScan Neon from either the PHP coding standards or from the Laravel coding standards. Don't forget to create yourselves a blank PHPScan baseline and import that. It can become useful later on. Again, we'll exclude paths of vendor. We'll exclude any IDE helpers, anything created by the IDE itself. And we've got a small missing skip there for check missing iterable value type. That's just something that we do have in place for some instances. We'll also create an ECS script. So we'll revisit ECS shortly to discuss more about what this does. Effectively, what this is doing is setting up ECS, which allows us to enforce our code style in a very understandable PHP interface. We can all understand what PHP is doing here, and it can be more complicated to do this in the standard routes. So the next step would be to publish the Enlighten config. This is also part of the packages that will get installed by our package. Here I've used Sail to do the job, but PHP Artisan would work just as well inside the container. We'll then configure Enlighten by bringing in the base path for our Enlighten analyzers, which adds a couple of extra things that we've written for our uses, such as single invocable controllers. So what are we using here? We're using linting, we're using static analysis, we're using coding standards. We're then assessing security, consistency, and efficiency with Enlighten. So why linting? Plain and simply because it highlights code errors for us. By putting this into a pipeline, we can actually catch these earlier, and it prevents these getting to production. More recently, IDEs will actually highlight code errors for you, but it's just another level of security on that. Why ECS? This allows us to ensure our standards for code are met. We can extend this easily, and it allows for in-editor highlighting of our custom standards. So ECS can be plugged into several different editors. The main one that has best integration at the moment is PHP Storm, but VS Code is fast catching up. So what standards do we apply? We'll apply PSR 12 and related other standards, so PSR 2. Some of our external standards, such as Squiz Labs, and we'll also implement some of our own standards on top of that. Why PHPScan? For us, it integrates better with Laravel than alternatives, allows us to have static analysis, and helps us to strengthen our code. Why Enlighten? This analyzes Laravel for security, consistency, performance, and maintainability. It's easily extendable. So this is only a part of our standards, and we'll revisit this slide in a minute. There's more that we have that applies outside of code. But for now, let's go and take a look at a little demo app. So this is a little blogging app that I produced for the purposes of this talk. As you can see, we've got a post. We can click through. We immediately start seeing some problems. So initially, it may look like our application works. We can go to my posts. That'll be a not found route. So there's several things here that would be done with testing. There are several things here that would be picked up by standards. We can, however, get to the add new post, and I would be able to add a new post. So hello PHPSW, and a really extensive hi there, I work. So we publish that, go back home, we can see it pops up. But we can already see just by clicking around a few times that we do have some problems. We can get to the post page, but we have something that's failing. We can get to the edit page, we can delete, we can update. So update that with I still work, and I can update. But again, it takes us back to our post, which has this error. So let's take a jump over to our IDE. Over here, I've got PHPStorm open, and I'm currently logged into the Docker container. So the first thing we set up was our scripts. So let's head over to composer.json, and we'll just check that those are there. And if we scroll down to scripts, yeah, we've got them all. We've got lint, check, static, analyze, and we've got the before push. The only one I'm not running here is the testing, because that's outside of the scope of this talk. Although for us internally, testing would be essential, and part of our standards is that if it can be tested, it is. So let's start by just seeing what's going wrong. Let's run our composer before push. So if I run composer before push, it will start by running through parallel lint for us. It's running 10 parallel jobs. It can take a little time to pick up the first time you run it. Once you've logged into a container, eventually it picks up, runs straight through. And when it does run through, it gives you results at the end, just like that. So you can see here that it's already chucked out one error. And that's one linting error. So let's have a look at what this tells us. So it tells us, yeah, we have one syntax error in one file. And it tells us here that the parse error was in comment controller. And it tells us that the error, they were expecting a semicolon before the closing bracket on line 19. So let's open up comment controller. And you can see here that PHPStorm is actually highlighting this for me, but a little semicolon, we can often miss that. So let's put the semicolon in, and we should now see that linter will pass through and be perfectly fine. And as you see there, after the first time, it was quite happy to run through a lot quicker. Now we've got some errors here that ECS is picking up. So ECS, or Easy Coding Standards, is basically built around PHPCS as an interface for it, with a few expansions on that. So we can see that it's picked up a fair few different things here, and it's suggesting lots of changes that it can make for us, as well as lots that we need to make ourselves. So this analyzed 53 files, and it found errors in 2 files by the looks of it. So the first error it's picking up on happens to be in comment control that we have open. So if we look here, this would be perfectly valid code on line 17, but actually our standards would say that you don't have spaces either side of the bracket, so it would want that. Now, in this instance, it's actually saying that it can correct this for us because it's giving us a red option and a green option that it will replace with. So we'll come back to that in a second, because there's a way that we can get ECS to fix this for us. So now let's have a look at post controller. This is picking up on another problem here. And again, this looks like it's just a code style thing. So here we have in post controller, if we open up post controller, we've got some code here that if we look for post query, here it is. So we can see here that this again is perfectly valid code. PHPStorm is perfectly happy with this. There's nothing actually wrong with this code. Now, our standards would suggest that what we do to solve this is we'll add in the spaces. So there's always a space between the first and second elements in any list of parameters. But there's also another area here that isn't necessarily being picked up on by ECS, and that's the line length. So in this case, it's exceeding over the end of our line length. So purely for a code style, we would normally separate these down so that you have each function would be on a new line, and then we'd have a space beside it. So that would be how we'd normally fix that. But again, ECS is suggesting that it can fix this for us. So we'll correct this one manually because we're seeing something more than ECS has seen on this occasion. But it's also telling us on create that it wants to separate out our union types. So this is a new PHP 8 feature. You can actually have two return types on the end of a function. And ECS is telling us that it wants us to space these out. But again, ECS is telling us it can fix this for us. And again, we've got the same on the show function. It's telling us there that on show in this file, we've got exactly the same problem. And again, we've got the same problem on edit. So you can see that ECS picks up quickly on varying different functions and varying different problems. But this has also picked up on something else in the edit function. So here we've got in red, it's highlighting a query and an if statement. So let's take a look through this and work out what this is suggesting we're doing. So here, I can see what this is. So we're using PerfectValue PHP, which is a single line if, which would be if these parameters are met, run the next line, else carry on. For our standards, we would always use the bracketed form, even for a single line. So we can add those in ourselves. But in this instance, ECS is telling us that it can fix it for us. So we can see there that it's suggesting that there's some fixes that it can do. But here are some fixes that it's suggesting it can't do for us. So if we open our users model, it looks like we've got a couple of errors over here. So let's have a look at the user model. And in the user model, it tells us that can post is not in camel caps. So what's this telling us? Essentially, it's telling us that can post should be like that. Now, it doesn't want to automatically fix this because it doesn't necessarily cascade all the way through to understand this. What we can do, though, is we can do can post as a search. We can see that this is used in a few different places. So let's do a replace. So we're fairly sure that the user function can post can be renamed can post in camel caps. So let's replace that. So this one's definitely calling the can post function off user because it's attached to the user method. Again, we can see the same there, and the same there. So we're safe to replace all of those. So that solves the can post issue. The next one, it's exactly the same problem. Is admin is not in camel caps format. So let's take a look at this. Again, we'll just do a quick search and replace. So is admin, and we'll search for the function. If I drag this out a bit, we should be able to see better. So in this case, we want to change it to is admin in camel case. So again, that's pulling off the user. So is that, so is that, so is that, so is that. These are cached entries, so we wouldn't normally replace them, but it's not actually going to cause any harm in this instance. So we've replaced those, and we should see that the only thing left for us to do here is replace that one. So now we can see that that's been replaced. Here is one that is really useful. So we have an unused parameter. Imagine an old wieldy function that you're in the process of refactoring. Let's say you've got 10 different parameters being passed in. ECS can pick up on unused parameters. So in this case, we actually only have one, and that could be a hangover from renaming it from has role and passing in a string. So let's remove that. Again, ECS isn't able to remove that for us automatically because it doesn't know for certain whether we want the parameter and we've forgotten to use it, or whether we don't want the parameter at all. So here it tells us that we found 3 errors that we need to fix manually, which we've done. But the good news is that there are 2 errors that are fixable, and it tells us exactly what to do, which is our _fix to the console command. So let's run that, and here we do vendor ECS. We'll always clear the cache, because that means it will rerun over everything, and we'll run the fix. So that runs over our 53 files. It tells us that ECS is now happy and tells us that there are no errors found. So if we run composer before push, we should now see that lint runs through, which it does. We should see ECS runs through, which it does. It tells us our code is shiny, and it moves on to PHPScan. Now, this is where standards get into their own with PHPScan and its abilities at detecting code that may not be exactly what you're expecting it to be. So even on a small, simple application like this, it's found 10 errors. So let's scroll back a little bit and let's see what we've got. So comment controller, it's on line 13. Let's go and take a look at line 13. So in this case, it's telling us that you can't implicitly create the array. So what that means is that input has not been defined before we've tried to add variables onto that. So let's for a minute assume that for whatever reason, we're not in a position to be able to just put in that line. Let's just presume for a minute that that's not possible. We can revisit that. And it'll be easily demonstrated by future functions, but we'll come back to how to get around that problem in a few seconds. So let's put in the input line. So we're defining input as an empty array. We're then adding to the input. We could, of course, create the array simply by putting in one row, in one array here, but for simplicity's sake, let's say that we want to do that. We'll then space this out so that it makes more sense. So here we're setting up our array. We're then modifying the array. We're getting the slug that we want to use from the input. We're then creating the input and we're redirecting back to the comment, to the slug of the post with the comment. So that solves that one. Let's have a look at the post controller. So here we can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 errors in one controller. So here we've got one where in post controller, look at that very first line, dynamic call to static method on the builder of order by, and that's on line 16. So let's go and take a look at line 16. And here we have post query and order by is passed in. Now we know that this is perfectly fine. This is perfectly valid. And we know in this instance that it actually has this wrong, that the order by is not necessarily just as a static. And this could be because we haven't set up the IDE helpers. It could be that PHPScan isn't configured to understand this, but essentially what we're seeing here is an error that there is no fix for, because we certainly don't want to be trying to call these statically, because that's invalid code. So again, we've got one here that we can't fix. It's also telling us that with posts is not a valid value on line 22. Again, this is a Laravel function that is not being picked up. So again, we know this is incorrect. If we look at line 58, which is the next one, if we scroll down to 58, you can see here that we have a show function with nothing being attached to the slug. So here we would normally go and look at the database, we check what value slug is, we would then put the closest type that we can find for that, or create a type if there isn't one. In this instance, we know that slug is actually a string, so let's just add in the type. And that means that we now can guarantee that what comes into this is a string, or at least has been cast to a string. Line 68, call to undefined method with post. So again, that's the same function as above that PHPScan hasn't understood. Line 71. So again, we've got the slug without a type hint. And we've got line 117. We have an ID without a type hint. So 117 is down here. So this is a destroy function. And we can see that there's no type in here. So we know that ID in our instance will be the primary key. And we know that in our instance, that's an integer. So define the type for integer. Now it's telling us that model's comment has no return type hint specified. So let's have a look at comment. And on line 20, we can see we have a post function for comment. And this tells us that there's no type hint specified. So again, this is perfectly valid code. It will execute. But for standards case, we'll tell it belongs to is the correct return type. And it's clearly easily findable by looking at the return type for belongs to. If you don't have the in browser highlighting, you can search for belongs to across, the in editor highlighting. You can search for belongs to, and you'll see that here it tells us that it returns belongs to from has relationships. So let's have a look at the model user. So again, we've got a couple of type hints that are not specified. Let's make a quick fix on these. So can post, we know we can work through this if this role is equal to author or this role is equal to admin. So in this instance, if we read through this, we're doing an exact comparison here, we're doing an exact comparison here, and we're returning an OR on that. So we can work out that that's a Boolean. So again, we'll define Boolean. And here is an even simpler option if this role is exactly equal to admin. So again, we'll create a Boolean. So we can see that PHPScan has its uses. Now we've fixed 10 of these errors. So we had 10 of these errors. Let's see what happens if we run this again. So lint passes straight through, ECS passes straight through, PHPScan runs, and it tells us that there are 3 errors left. So these are the 3 errors that we've concluded are where PHPScan is getting this wrong. So earlier on, I said create yourself a blank PHPScan baseline file. So if I look for the neon highlighting, we'll just use plain text. We can see that at the moment, this is a blank file. So here what we do, we want to generate our baseline. So these are errors that we want to get ignored. And we'll pass in the memory limit. 2 gig. And we'll pass in generate baseline. And I knew I'd forget something. There we go. It's PHPScan, not PHP. So that's generated our baseline for us. And if I just get that to refresh, we can see that this has given us the contents of the baseline file. So in the baseline file, we can see that it gives us an exact match method. An exact match message. It gives us a count of the number of times it's seen it and a path to the file that it's in. So here we can see view with posts, call to undefined method. We can see that that's in post controller twice. And again, we have this dynamic call to static method in post controller once. So we can see here that that gives us a nice baseline of errors that we're saying, that's okay, I'm happy to go with that as a problem. So if we go back to Composer before push, we'll now get int pass-through. We'll get ECS pass-through. PHPScan will do its job and it will return no errors. And now it moves on to enlighten. So this is where Laravel specific standards can come into this. So we can see here that there are 48 things being checked in this instance. There is another mode that we can run for this that will check 65 separate things. And there's a professional mode that you pay a small amount for that would run 127, I think it is, checks. So we can see here that it failed. It tells us that it failed 1 consistency, 2 performance, 2 reliability, 2 security, and 7 in total. So if we scroll back to the beginning of here, we can see that enlighten scanned. The first thing it picked up on is whether all controllers are single action invocable controllers. Clearly they're not. So in this instance, we would want to be able to ignore this, or we'd want to refactor each of these into individual functions, into individual controllers, and we would define them as invocable controllers. This is because for us, we would rather have 100 controllers that do one thing than one controller that does 100 things. Imagine a single file that you know is called posts index, and that index has just that chunk of code in it that you need to worry about. It makes it so much easier to narrow down where problems may be. So we can revisit that shortly. And the next error it found is a proper queue driver is configured. So this is telling us that our environment file is not configured to use a queue driver that would be useful in a production environment. So it's telling us that sync will slow things down. And if we look at the config queue.php, it tells us queue connection is a default of sync. And if we look at our end file, we can see that queue connection is actually sync. So here, what we'd want to do is we'd want to change that to Redis. Now, what Enlighten is doing here is it's looking at the way the application is configured. It's actually starting the application in many cases to make analysis of how things are set up. So we fix this problem just by changing this, and we can see that in a few minutes by rerunning our setup. The next element is unused global middleware. So it tells us that our unused middleware includes trust proxies, and it gives us documentation links. So here we've got a link straight to Laravel Enlighten and unused global middleware analyzer. Let's say I'm new to middleware and I have no idea what this is talking about. Let's follow the link. And that will take us to links opened on another screen. So that takes us to this page here. So here it tells us that there may be, it tells us an introduction to what the problem is, how to fix it. So to fix this issue, simply remove all unused global middleware from your kernel class. And it links some references that we might want to look at. So here we'd look through, it's a minor severity problem and it'd take you 5 minutes to fix. So in this case, we've got trusted proxies was the one it picked up on. So let's have a look at our kernel class. And the middleware that it's telling us is a problem, not using it, so let's get rid of it. So the next one is cache prefixes set to avoid collisions with other apps. So this is where you may have multiple elements, multiple applications running on a single server, and it tells us that we can find this at config cache line 108, and it tells us very simply how we fix this, and that's a non-generic name in our environment file. So let's take a look at our environment file, and you can see we've got it called Laravel, so let's call it PHP Southwest. So it's done an analysis of our composer JSON file, and it's passed that. We can see there are several things that it's analyzing that are perfectly happy. So everything is there in the end file. They're all in the example and the end file. That's actually an extremely useful thing for when you're sharing across different developers. So let's say for whatever reason that our end file didn't have those two in the env example, it will actually pick up on that and tell us that there are missing entries. So we'll put those back in because we know at the moment it's passing quite happily. Our next failure that we see is a bit further down. So we can see several things are being tested here. So your application contains an NVMRC file, does not contain an NVMRC file to enforce a consistent node or npm version. It tells us exactly how to solve that, which is node version to NVMRC. So we could execute that and we'll just check whether that's going to work. So node isn't installed on our Docker. If we go outside of there and run it there, and then we come back in, we know that that one will be fixed. So that was the NVM here. We can see that there are several more that are perfectly happy. The next one that we've got an issue with is your application uses stable versions of dependencies. This failed. Your application's dependencies are unstable. This may include bug fixes and or security patches. It's recommended to update to the most stable versions. This is actually a really useful little feature of Enlighten. When I first met this, it caused me no end of headaches trying to understand why we'd want to do this all the time to keep things up to date. The answer is because if you don't do it all the time to keep things up to date, you don't keep things up to date. So this tells you that we have problems. There's also a companion one here that's telling us that there's a back-end dependency with a known security issue. So this is looking at a list of security issues. It's telling us that the version of fly system we have in place has a vulnerability, and it's a race condition that enables remote code execution. So that's quite a serious condition. Sorry, quite a serious problem. So to fix those is actually really easy. Composer update. So let's run composer update and see what we get run through. And we'll see that these will eventually update as it picks up. It's updating the dependencies now. So it's got quite a few there that were out of date on this application. It's even telling us that our own coding standards were out of date here. So as you can see, there is a significant number of updates here. Let that run through for a second. And as that completes on the other end of that, it'll extract, it'll install anything that was missing. And once this is finished installing, we'll see what results we get now. Nearly there at 87, 90. 95. really does take its time to right when you need it to be quicker. So it's obviously thinking hard about this last package, and I suspect it's going to be something useful. Yeah, it was Rove security advisories that it was sticking on. It's now generating our auto-load files. So in the process of that, it updated our own standards. So we now might be in a position where actually our standards have been updated and it's picking up something new. So there's nothing in lint, there's nothing in ECS, PHPScan picked up nothing. Enlighten, so we've still got the invocable controllers failing, but that's okay. So here we've got an issue with licenses, and I'll show you how to fix that in a second. So this is a useful one for picking up on licenses that you may not be able to use, but we have just 3 failing things now. So we've got these licenses which you can look at. We've got so this is now telling us that Horizon is needed because we're using the Redis driver. So that's quite a useful suggestion. Horizon is a controller for queues, allows you to balance queue workers, allows you to strategically control how you do Redis queues. And obviously we have this analyzer here for invocable single controllers. So let's look at this license one first. So here we have that it's failing on a couple of licenses. If we open up Enlighten filing config and we scroll down a little bit, we can see here that it's running the analyzers from our path here. This is what it's checking for us. And if we scroll down to here, so we can see some licenses here. So let's have a look at what we're missing here. So it's telling us that NetEutils wants BSD3 clause, so that's in our list. GPL 2.0 only, that's not in our list. GPL 3.0 only is not in our list. So for us, let's say we've done our due diligence and we've decided that we can use these 2 licenses in production. We'll add that to the license whitelist. And if we run before push again, we should now be down to 2 errors on Enlighten as it runs through. Now this is interesting, it's just picked up on an error. And the error it's picked up on is actually on our config file. So this is where it becomes useful. When you're making quick changes, I could have committed that without running these standards, and we'd have had something that didn't meet the standards we have, which is to have the comma at the end. But actually our full standards would be to have each one of these on a separate line. So let's just get that in place anyway. And if we go through, line these up, we'll see that this will actually quite happily pass through in a second once we've got there. There we go, that's now laid out correctly. And if we do compose before push again, lint is okay, ECS is okay this time, PHPScan is okay, Enlighten still has an issue. So the issue that Enlighten has is with the Horizon install and invocable controllers. So let's assume for a moment that for whatever reason we cannot fix these in production. and we don't want to use Enlighten. We don't want to use Horizon, and we don't want these controllers to be refactored just yet. What we can do is we can run a baseline function, which will tell it to ignore certain errors. So we run the baseline, let it scan the code base, and this will populate a couple of things for us once it's finished running the scan, which can take as long. So it ran through 67 things there because we actually ran the full scan. And if we look, it's added in a few things into our don't report here. So let's lay this out to see what it's skipped, which will show you some of the other elements that are within Enlighten that makes this for us one of the most useful standards that we have. So we can see here that it's actually picked out 5 different things. So this is one of our own standards, invocable controller. So let's quickly go over here. You can see that this, it's relatively simple to understand what's going on here. You've got an error message that gets returned. You've got an actual handler function, which will run through, analyze files. If the class does not have the method invoke, mark it's failed, otherwise don't. That can be how easy it is to expand on what Enlighten can do. So the Horizon Suggestion Analyzer is the one that we've seen. Some of the other ones that it will pull out is things like custom error pages. So non-custom error pages can give away what framework you're using, or it can give away details of the page if it's the wrong type, details of the code if it's the wrong type. It suggests certain things for PHP ini that should be turned on or off in certain circumstances. It'll also look for cross-site scripting errors as well as a few other things. So now we've added them, let's see what happens if we run Composer before push just once more. Lint passes, ECS fails. So why is ECS failing? It's failing because we don't have a trailing comma. Stick the trailing comma in, that will pass. PHPScan will run through perfectly fine. So it still tells us that these are a problem. But if we get to the other end, this one always takes a little bit of time to think about on 44. And as you can see, it tells us that it failed, but it doesn't give us an error result. So it's useful when we want to run in pipelines with certain errors in place. So if I comment that one out, we'll see again that it does create an error. So it's telling us here that we have another problem. Yeah, so it's actually complaining about where it put the comment line. So if we run that again, ECS will fly through, Stan will go through, it'll be perfectly happy. And if we let this run through, we'll see that the very end, we will actually get an error result, not a success result, because we've turned off that particular ignore or don't report. So you can see there, it errored with a code 1. So in our case, we want that to pass, and we can see now that we have standards that are in place that has already strengthened this code. We've also seen how we might be able to turn them off in certain circumstances that would matter. And we've also seen just a small overview of the things that we've got in place. But just one more thing to show you is that actually it doesn't necessarily catch every single error. This doesn't make all of your problems go away. So it's telling us here that post, did you mean posts? So Actually, in our case, we're looking at the post view controller. And that is a show.blade. So in this case, we'll do a quick replace on posts, check that everything goes through. And if I refresh that, we can see that actually, although standards are useful, they are not infallible. It is possible to still have things go to production. So manual testing, unit testing, and browser-based testing are also part of what we do with standards. But going back to our final slide, this is only part of our standards. We have standards that apply to every single part of our stack. Over time, these standards have evolved to cover not just how we code, but how we estimate, how we present to clients, how we manage our projects, and almost every other part of the business. At that point, I'm going to stop sharing and see if we have any questions.
Thank you very much. If people do have questions, if you want to ask them through audio, if you raise a hand, I can do that, or type them in the Q&A or the chat section. We can pick them up there. I'll just give it a moment for people to ask.
I've got a question.
Go for
it. Single action invocable controllers. Why?
So this is more of a style thing for us than any particular code benefit as such. It's more about making it easier for understanding where things are going to be in code. If you have, for example, a massive controller that does everything related to the user, you're not going to know where in that file to look immediately. You're not going to know what the error might, what errors you might see there. It's also a thing of, for us, we would rather have multiple files split over much wider area than a single file, because then it keeps maintainability small. Let's say we wanted to kill a root. For us, with invokables or even single action, not necessarily invocable, single action will achieve the same thing. It would allow you to remove one file, remove the root, and that will, in essence, get rid of the root entirely. There can be other complications, obviously, depending on how embedded things have become, but it's decoupling it as much as we can from anything else.
Yeah, I've seen out of control controllers, and like from that perspective, it sounds like a really good idea. And then I think of what that then means, which is like loads of controllers potentially, but actually perhaps having loads of controllers in that circumstance doesn't actually really matter, because it actually is giving you that granular that has more benefits.
Yeah, and another thing that we'll do is we'll have controllers inside folders. So we'll have a folder for post, then we'll have a post create that's invocable. We'll have a post delete that's invocable.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think I saw another question or comment.
Yeah, there's a question in the Q&A from Craig. When you say it helps with quotations, can you expand on that?
Sorry, no, I didn't actually mean that the standards themselves help with quotations. What I meant was we have other standards that we apply to how we quote. So we'll look at making sure that we're covering every possible avenue for infrastructure and standing up new elements of infrastructure. We'll cover time for testing. We'll ensure that the there's enough time for things in there, such as we will from a very early stage begin breaking down larger stories to smaller, littler stories, and then potentially even single actions. So create a migration for the new table could be an element that we'll put onto the quotation, and we'll know that a migration will take us, say, 10 minutes to write, but we might not know that 50 migrations is what we need, and it can get complicated trying to add these things up. So it's more about implementing something that works within your scenario. Although saying that, it can actually help with quotations once you've got standards in place on a code base, because then you can trust that your code is already up to the standard that you work to. So you can lose a lot of the time that you'll spend doing things like refactoring functions. You could already have done that. There was a comment as well from Mike. He says single action invocable controllers allow for easier versioning of endpoints. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It makes it so much easier to version. If you're stepping up 3 versions and you've got a single endpoint, you can go and upgrade just one of them.
Speaking of versioning, you mentioned running Composer Update and running it regularly to keep all the dependent libraries as up to date as possible. How often do you find that you run Composer Update, and what do you rely on after doing that to make sure that everything is still working correctly? Is it fully reliant on automated tests, or do you have specific procedures that you follow after doing a Composer Update?
So there's several components to that. Firstly, Composer Update is run as often as we can, within reason. It won't tell you to go from version 8 to version 9, for example, but it might tell you to go from 8.1 to 8.2. We will run that within. I've actually had it where on my local machine, I've run the standards. Enlighten says, hey, you're fine. Get to the pull request and it says, not anymore. So I've actually had it where Enlighten has, in that 2 or 3 seconds, has actually seen a package pushed out that needed to be updated. So beyond that, the things that we'll rely on is, 1, the standards will pick up if anything is dramatically wrong. 2, automated testing at unit level. So there's a whole other talk I do on test-driven development, but essentially for us, it's about covering as many pathways as it is physically possible to cover through the code at the smallest units you can. And this is another element of our code style that will stick to single action functions. So you'll have seen there that I had a function for isAdmin that is literally doing a Boolean check. By having that in a function, it then means I can test that. It means I can test what happens if it passes, what happens if it fails that to Boolean return. But it also means I can do other things like I can pass in an integer and see if it gets an error. Does that error get handled all the way through? There's then automated browser testing. So for the main part, we'll use Cypress for that, which sits on top of Selenium. That gives us another level of confidence that we've got tests in place that would quite easily step through and allow us to hit endpoints, check what's on the screen, wait for other things. A lot of this is down to testing, but it's also down to trusting in your own code. So if you've got to the point where the standards are passing regularly, there's a project that I've worked on where when I first started on that project, there was in essence, no tests working. That is now in a much better position. There's lots of tests in place that help to bring that up to date. And I can begin to trust that those tests are accurate, but it doesn't completely wipe out the need for manual testing. And if we've updated Rove securities, then it's probably not going to have an effect on the actual site. But if it's updated something more important, like it's upgraded from, I don't know, Laravel 8.46 to Laravel 8.47, then we might go, okay, let's run through our manual tests as well.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, question from Robin. Is there an easy reversion option? So for example, it tells you to update a package N, and that update has a serious error in it, which breaks things. Can you easily unupdate package N?
Yep, small commits. The smaller your commit, the better. If it pulls out an update, we'll make sure everything else is committed first. So then if we run the update and it breaks on our local machines, we can immediately see there's a problem. There is a method for rolling back in Composer. I cannot for the life of me think what that is.
Yeah, I feel like I've come across that as well, but equally, maybe someone else in the chat is going to answer that one. I don't know, but I know that there is something.
Yeah, there definitely is a method for it, and I can't think what it is. But a lot of, again, this is another standard that we have in place, small pull requests. We'd rather have 10 small pull requests at 2 or 3 files each than 1 pull request at 30. So much easier to review 2 files.
So a question from me. I always find with the sort of adding standards in, it's great if you're starting a project from scratch. I don't know how much of inheriting code or older code bases where it hasn't strictly enforced that you do, but how would you approach starting to introduce them or starting to introduce these sort of standards checks into an existing project?
Okay, so there are 2 approaches you can take. The first one is the big bang, put the standards in place, spend the next 6 months fixing everything. That is not always an option, especially if customers are involved. The other option is you put the standards in place, you generate the baselines for anything that is already broken. That then says this can be no worse than this point. So if you've got a PHPScan baseline, you would immediately be running your PHPScan generate baseline. That would then say you've got, let's say, 1,000 errors. The next time you run that, if it shows you an error on screen, you know that's something that you changed. The way you then deal with that is you don't leave code in the same state as you saw it. So for example, if you're in a service that has a few functions and you're making a change in that service, clean up the rest of the function you're in. So then you'll start reducing the number of errors you're seeing.
Yep.
And a lot of it is slow going when you're on legacy projects, but it helps. It can get you to the point that effectively you almost become second nature with the standards, and like missing those commas at the end of the arrays was actually hard work because I naturally want to put it in because that's now a standard that I see.
Yeah, and then you deal with something YAML or, well, not YAML, or something that doesn't like that standard and catches you. Yeah, I've been on that one.
or you put a comma at the end of a JSON file and you're like, why isn't this? Oh yeah.
And so do you tend to, I know you had it sort of or turned all the way up? Do you tend to go in all the way baseline and then go to that rather than trying to go at lower? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we'll baseline if there's a significant number of errors, we'll baseline it and then fix bit by bit. The only one that is a little more complicated to baseline is ECS. That can prove pretty complicated to get it to ignore certain things, because that's where you need to start putting in comments. So there's, for example, there's one file in the project I work on that I had to put an ECS ignore at the top of the file, because the way that it's written doesn't meet the standards. It's not wrong, but it doesn't meet the standards, and there wasn't the scope to be able to rewrite it to meet the standards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Does anyone else have any other questions at the moment?
There's no such thing as a bad question. I think somebody has their hand up there.
Yeah, the hand was up, then it disappeared. If you did want to speak, I can do it, but I don't want to sort of force you onto screen if you don't want to.
Yeah, I'll share the slides for you afterwards.
Hopefully that should be allowing you to talk.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you guys hear me? How does, if at all, this link with things like Laravel ID helper and Laravel debug bar? Okay, not the debug bar probably, but the ID helper.
So the IDE helper in many instances will actually help to solve some of the things that PHPScan sees. I'm not entirely sure on the full ins and outs of how it does it, but it picks up on what the IDE helper has presented as the varying different elements that it builds in, like the parameters on models and things like that. And it will actually help to solve some of those for you, because it's picking up on that, and it's picking up on all of the things that IDE helper has put in. The other thing is that, as I said earlier, standards aren't necessarily the be-all and end-all of everything in terms of how you look at your code. So we have certain standards that are unenforced as such, but are beliefs in how we write our code. So for example, actions would be one element that we use a lot of, because again, it keeps our code small, concise, testable. Don't necessarily be afraid of a conversation about, okay, this is flagging this up. Is there something better I can do here? That's a conversation that we have a lot. I will be talking to different developers 2-3 times a day over different elements of code and discussing collaboratively what's the best way of handling this issue. Sometimes they're not. There isn't a better way, and then the answer is ignore the standard.
One more thing whilst I have the floor. There is a sort of PHPScan plugin for PHP Storm, at least for some of the more recent versions of it. And
Yep.
How does that sort of compare to, because obviously you have it set up in your post, what do you call it, in your composer action. How does that
Yep.
compare to?
So PHPScan in the IDE is absolutely brilliant for identifying the problem in the file that you have open. But what if you're changing file number 1 affects file number 2? That's where you start getting into problems with any of the IDE plugins. I think to a certain extent, there's actually a case of it's almost a convenience to have it as a single composer action. We could, of course, go through the files and we could run each one individually. It's just a convenience that we have it as a composer action. It gets to a point once you've been doing it for a while that actually you don't even commit stuff that actually has errors, and the composer action afterwards is just a double check that you've been following the standards that are predefined.
Okay, that's all. Thanks.
No. So there's a couple of questions there from Michael. First one, have you considered Rector for automatic code fixing? Honest answer, no. Part of the things that we put in around standards is that people learn to fix these for themselves where necessary. So yes, there's the convenience of fixing some of the little things, but it's learning what the standards mean, not just having something fix it for you. So let's just say for whatever reason, PHPScan disappeared tomorrow. Those standards don't change. But what does change is we haven't then necessarily got a tool to automate that. So then we're looking at, okay, well, most of our developers have learned this. Most of our developers are following this. I don't know of discussions higher than me in the company around Rector. We have used Rector on one project before, and it created major problems because Rector decided that it was a great idea to put the full namespaces into absolutely everything. So everywhere that it was calling a file inside a function, you got the full path to the namespace. And even now, 12 months on, I'm still finding files that that's the case. The second question, who agrees the standards? Are they preferences or company standards? They're a company-wide standard, but they're an evolving standard. It's not a static, fixed, here's the standards, you must do this. It's, here are the standards we're aiming for, here is what we're doing. But if you come up against a problem, talk about it. That's one thing that Jump is absolutely exceptional, is the communication between the developers. It's second to none. I don't know of another company as open as we are for collaborative coding, where you can literally say, I'm looking at this line of code, it's telling me this, help. And the help will be there as soon as it is physically possible to do so. We also have open discussions in channels on Slack about how we solve certain things.
Yeah, that's good. We've got discussions ongoing about evolving standards where I am as well. It's evolving is a good way of describing it, and yeah, it's good to have that collaboration with people, because you know, quite often it's the discussion that's important to come to that collective agreement, rather than sort of that kind of otherwise everyone's kind of off on their own standards, and they might not necessarily sort of an adjustment here or there can make something so much better, and that only comes about through working with a team that's really open to discussion and finding out why someone might think a certain way and why someone else might think another certain way, and then somehow reaching that kind of common ground, because otherwise it doesn't work. I think particularly with remote working, it's an interesting one as well, because it does, I think, almost in some ways promote the collaboration in some ways from my perspective. Certainly, like working with other developers remotely is sometimes almost, it's easier to kind of just have a one-to-one discussion or something with somebody about something perhaps it might have been otherwise. So yeah, sorry, I'm gone off on one about remote working now. Yeah.
Lovely. In which case, thank you very much, Chris, for speaking this evening.
Thank you for
Very
having
much
me.
appreciated. And thank you everyone for coming along.